Well, welcome to the sixth installment of Arctic Resilience Forum 2020, hosted by the Icelandic Chairmanship of the Arctic Council and co-organized by the Sustainable Development Working Group and our Arctic Initiative here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Joel Clement, and this week's episode is focused on the role of gender equity and empowerment in building Arctic resilience. And we have another fantastic lineup of speakers and thought leaders to discuss the way forward. But before we begin, just a word about last week's session, which focused on broadband connectivity. That fantastic session exposed, again in this series, all of the interconnections, and this time quite literally, among resilience themes. We can't talk about health or education needs in the Arctic without talking about broadband. We can't talk about broadband without talking about infrastructure and innovation. We can't talk about infrastructure without talking about finance, and on and on. So as we go forward, the forum sessions just continuously weave together, causing us to look more closely at the most important enabling conditions for resilience. The fact is, the people of the Arctic do not live single issue lives, so we need to be wary of focusing on single issue adaptations. Before our very eyes, as we proceed through this forum, we're seeing how the resilience frame allows us to see and respond to these interconnections more effectively. So let's get started with this session on gender and empowerment. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. You do have a button at the bottom of your screen for interpretation. So I recommend you click on English or Russian, depending on your preference, because if you don't, you'll hear both. And that gets a little confusing. Now, as the session goes on, at any point, you can enter your questions into that Q&A button, which is right there on the bottom as well. And those questions will then be steered toward the session moderator, so the panelists can respond. And also, you received a link to the Slack channel. And that Slack channel allows you to continue conversations before, during, and after the session. So please do jump in there with any questions or follow-up you'd like to make. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. Let me get you started by introducing today's MC, Andrei Petrov. He's the president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, IASC. He's the chair of the IASC Social and Human Working Group. He's the director of the Arctic Center at the University of Northern Iowa, and he's the co-lead author for the Gender Equality in the Arctic Phase 3 report, the chapter on empowerment. All right, so thanks very much for joining, and take it away, Andrei.
Thank you, Joel. It's, of course, my distinct pleasure to be chairing such a distinguished session, this is a distinguished panel that devoted to such an important issue. Of course, you will hear today, once again, from many speakers about the importance of gender in building resilient communities and socio-ecological systems. Resilience, of course, is built upon diversity. And if we cherish the diversity, if we ensure that all genders, all members of our community are empowered to pursue their own ideas, their own lives, that actually builds resilience. It also provides and underpins sustainable development in Arctic communities. And I think that's why it's very important that we hold this session. It's very important that we have such a good list of speakers. A lot of them are involved this way or the other in the gender equality in the Arctic report, that is, of course, a part of Sustainable Development Working Group agenda. But I won't be taking too much of your time, and of course, provide an opportunity for our speakers to share their thoughts and their knowledge. So we have, as I said, a distinguished list. Our first and opening speaker will be Carla Jensen-Williamson, Assistant Professor of Educational Foundation at the University of Saskatchewan, and also lead author on the Gender Equality Report chapter on violence and reconciliation. Then we'll hear from our other speakers, which would be Maria Rozanova-Smith from George Washington University, Varvara Korkina, an Indigenous Early Career Scholar from Siberia. Then we have Bridget Larocque, who is a vice co-chair of the Sustainable Development Working Group and also heads Arctic Athabascan Council delegation to Sustainable Development Working Group. Then we'll hear from Soren Starch-Nielsen, who is the acting Greenland project director for Ocean North and a very well-known political and government figure in Greenland, as well as Hartle Hund Logadottir, who is, of course, co-founder and director of the Arctic Initiative at Harvard University. So everybody will have 5 minutes, so Carla has a little bit more as our lead, and then we'll have reflections and the discussant and the end, which I'll announce in a few minutes when we're done with that. So if you have questions, please make sure you type them in Q&A, and we'll have an opportunity after our first group of speakers spoken. We'll have hopefully time to entertain a few questions. But without further delay, I would invite Carla Jessen-Williamson, University of Saskatchewan, to kind of set up a tone and start this exciting conversation. Carla, please turn on your video and audio, and you could begin.
Thank you very much. Of course, I am deeply honored to be asked to, by the organizers to open this session on empowerment, gender, and resilience in the Arctic. And I hope that my remarks are going to be helpful for any of the Arctic peoples and the pending report. I always feel very honored to be born and brought up in the Arctic. And I kid you not when I say that I feel that this honor is something that sits more or less like a halo above my head wherever I go and wherever I went in any of the countries that I have been to. In terms of resilience, this is something that's really deeply seated in our ways of being in the far north among the many peoples, and it's a very admired condition by the people of being able to lead a good life. And I have to admit that this good life is something that is deeply desired, not just by the Inuit, but also by the First Nations. And here where I live in Saskatchewan, there is a term that's called Wakodowin, namely that of being able to lead oneself and navigate life in a good way to a good life. And so the studies of resilience are in that light not very new to me, because it's deeply desired in the far north. But back in 2005, while I was residing in Ottawa, I ran into a study group at McGill University in Montreal that was led by Dr. Lawrence Kermeyer at the Jewish Hospital. And they were looking into resilience from the Indigenous perspective. He gathered a small group of Métis, First Nations, and myself as an Inuit. And we had lots of very great discussions and debates about the term resilience, because we had the sense that this was a new form of universal truth to be studied in a way that whatever comes out was universally applicable. But as a group, we were tired of theories from academia. We were tired of studies that were carried on, showing in many ways the maladjustment, as they were saying, under the assimilation, how weak we were, how sickly we were, and how backwards we were. And we were anxious to show our strength and combating this very sad reality. So we were really enthusiastic that way. So the study as far as on resilience on the Inuit in Canada, it does come from the incredible high suicide rate among the, particularly the Inuit. And I do know that the numbers are growing in the First Nations communities across Canada, and it's growing very rapidly as we talk. So I'm sure that the resilience studies would be coming about. So the study of the resilience then comes very much from the academic theories and dealing with individuals to families to that of communities. And one of my colleagues there talked about the resilience or the suicide rate to be coming directly from colonialism. And he had interviewed family members post-suicide in Nunavut and did really well. But he's the one that really did come up with that. But otherwise, Resilience studies, as I was saying, came from the point of view of the high suicide rate and trying to make some kind of sense of it. My own sense back then on Inuit resilience was very much in area of adaptation and that of evoking hope. Back then, I thought that Inuit evoked hope in form of their social environment to that of the physical environment. So Nuriyunuk or Nuriyut is incredible effort and patience and indeed passion that really that Inuit thought were going to be realities that present themselves to their new social environment. Of course, the latter now involves the self-governing institutions. And as Jack Hicks thought that this was very much part of the colonial legacy that we have inherited. Indeed, the way that Inuit negotiate their empowerment is indeed from within the parameters of the continuing strong assimilationist kind of policies put in place by the nation states and that of the adhering self-governing institutions across the Arctic. So we can actually talk about how Inuit negotiate the empowerment in form of regaining lands, regaining resources, regaining languages, regaining social organization, regaining that of ways of knowing, authority to educate children among these new institutions. So these, in many ways, are the social organization in form of institutions that we have, in fact, inherited what's called systemic racism, systemic problems whereby the indigenous and that of the Inuit needs are secondary to the way in which that the institutions are run. So that's on that end for my purposes on the resilience and that of the empowerment. As far as the gender is concerned, of course, in my own chapter, I dealt with that from the point of view of what academia had to say about how to understand gender and violence. But I did my own studies in my own hometown in Maniitsoq in form of the gender and empowerment, and realized that this had to be understood from the point of view of holistic ways of knowing and holistic ways of being, and realized that as Galaslit, we do indeed see ourselves as physical beings. That's just 1/3 of our relation. But second one is very important one, namely that of the Anasak, which is the soul or the name. And the third aspect is Damnik good, which is really that of the spirit and then of the relationship of the land. So when you look at the gender empowerment, it's very important for anyone to understand that previously the indigenous people really relished the idea that as human beings, we are just that gender neutral, and that life had to be enjoyed in form of empowerment, gender empowerment, through the language that remains to be genderless. We have no he or she implied in our sentences. It's always about the personhood. We also learned that through the name and soul, that we are, the names used to be genderless until Christianity was introduced. And so language-wise and name-wise and intellect-wise, gender did not really matter. As far as the spirit is concerned, we are part of the land, we are part of the creation, and anyone has access to that, to these qualities through the spirit. So when we are talking about holistic human being, we are in fact, from the Inuit point of view, looking at the threesome, these 3 spheres that speak to gender equality. How these then are interpreted or not at all to these present social institutions that we experience through the self-government, that remains to be a really big question. So I'm not going to go on, and these are my small contributions, but as I was saying, I hope that this will be useful opening up this session. Thank you.
Carlos, thank you very much. Okay, I try to start my camera. Sounds good. Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk and connecting for us, you know, resilience, empowerment, and gender, I think, in such an eloquent way. I mean, it was, of course, very interesting and provides us with a good platform to begin with our speakers. So our first speaker, the team working on empowerment chapter in the GS3 report, and our first presenter is Maria Rosanov-Smith from George Washington University. Please, Maria. We have the same background. Good.
Yes, let me share my screen. All right. So hello, everyone, and I would like to thank all the organizers of this fantastic panel of great importance to the future of all Arctic communities. And I would like to start with a question: what is gender empowerment in the Arctic, and what we need to learn and understand about this relatively new topic of research in social science in the Arctic? So first of all, I would like to thank the National Science Foundation for support of this project. And as Andrei mentioned, that this is a part of the GR3 report, Gender Equality in the Arctic report. And all the contributors from our diverse group of experts and indigenous scholars and GR3 team under leadership of Embla Otsdottir. So many thanks for tremendous contributions that actually helped us to answer or just to navigate this research. And here I would like to present the key outcomes. So when it comes to gender empowerment, we identify 3 spheres of empowerment in the Arctic. So the first one is gender political empowerment. And that means equal and meaningful participation in political decision-making and responsibility sharing in all spheres at all levels in the Arctic communities. The second sphere that we focused on is gender economic empowerment. That means equal and meaningful participation in economic decision-making and responsibility sharing in all spheres and at all levels. And the third sphere of gender empowerment in the Arctic is civic empowerment, which is a process of enhancing capability of civil society actors to facilitate change of gender-related social norms and practices in the Arctic. And to measure the spheres of gender empowerment in Arctic communities, we created the list of indicators. And based on the outcomes, we just see that it's not just one Arctic, but many different Arctics. And based on key findings, our research clearly identified divergent gender empowerment trends across the Arctic regions and communities aimed at both closing or widening gender gaps. So speaking of gender political leadership gaps that still exist in the Arctic communities, if you can see, we can compare on this infographics gender balance of total population and women's representation in elected regional and city bodies. So with an exception of Russia that has the highest female gender ratios, most other Arctic regions have just slightly lower male gender ratios. And at the same time, we see that women's representation in elective regional and city bodies indicator demonstrates that with an exception of Chukotka and some Nordic regions, women remain much less likely to participate in the political sphere than men across all the Arctic regions. But even it's not just about the numbers, even in many regional elected and city bodies, traditional gender division of labor persists. Women are much less likely to have access to certain spheres of governance, such as what we call traditional male domain of politics, for example, natural resource management policies, infrastructure, industrial policies, and most likely still remain in the framework of traditional female domain of caregivers, not breadwinners. So speaking of economic gaps, and here we also see female pay gaps is still significant across most of the Arctic regions. And for example, if we compare gender gap in tertiary attainment level and gender earnings gap, we see clearly that we have still a great paradox, Arctic paradox. Existing gender gap in tertiary entertainment level in all Arctic regions except Faroe Islands indicate a trend of feminization of human capital in the Arctic. It also highlights that paradox that women have higher educational attainment, but are more likely to be paid less or much less than men, with exception in Nunavut here. Also, women are less likely than men to get enrolled and obtain a leadership position in such spheres as natural resource industries, military, science and technology, or what we call STEM professions. Overall, despite women's increasing participation in the workforce, traditional gender-based division of labor prevails, and traditional female occupations in social spheres, that what we see are still for women. And of course, it's not about equal access or shared responsibilities. So what we see is that empowering all genders in all spheres at all levels to effectively participate, contribute, and share responsibility is one of the major steps towards the sustainable, resilient, and most importantly, thriving communities. So without closing the gaps, we cannot really achieve sustainable development goal, and we cannot really think about our future Arctic as thriving Arctic, not just resistant to shock, not just sustainable or resilient. And very quickly, I would like just to present policy relevant highlights that we really need to think about moving gender empowerment from the periphery to the center of public policy discourse and decision making. And it's not just about women access and participation in political, economic, and civic spheres that must be improved, but it's also about male empowerment or self-empowerment in many Arctic communities. It's important to say that in the Arctic, there is no one-size-fits-all policy solution. Culturally, politically, and economically diverse Arctic regions require different approaches to improve gender empowerment and overcome gender equality gaps. And of course, indigenous peoples' traditions and perspectives have to be enrolled, incorporated, and acknowledged in a practical framework of gender knowledge building and policy making. And of course, I would like just to finish with this statement that thriving women, and not only women, but all genders, both contribute and depend on thriving communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mari. And now we have a little bit to add from Varvara Korkina, who is also on the same chapter. And we have an important element talking about economic empowerment of indigenous young people. And if she could provide a brief comment on that, it would be great. So
hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today. So I would like to share my screen, which I cannot start doing. while our participant is sharing. I hope I will do it soon. Okay. So, yes. So, how I do it? I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I don't use it for a long time, but female indigenous entrepreneurship as a tool for economic empowerment in the Arctic communities. So when we start talking about empowerment, we have to remember that empowerment as a concept is of course, a Western concept, and what happened to indigenous communities, we have to adjust our traditional economy to these westernized economies, and seems like indigenous women and youth could be a little bit more resilient to it, and why it's so important to talk about female entrepreneurship in the Arctic. So it brings economic development to communities. Um, uh, Female entrepreneurship channelize traditional activities to business mode while preserving traditions and not allowing outsiders to expropriate indigenous cultural heritage. It brings cash flow oriented on tourism market and the outside customers, more resilient to climate and social change. Also engage youth and especially girls, creating local employment in communities, and involve urban youth as artists, entrepreneurs, and consumers. So when we are talking about indigenous female entrepreneurship, mostly that is about cultural economy, but I wanted also to mention that cultural economy, of course, has to connect, and it is connected to traditional livelihood and our lands. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this intervention. So that will be all part of this GA3 report. And now we're actually very pleased that Elizabeth Biscay was able to join us. She's a special advisor to the minister responsible for the status of women in the government of Northwest Territories. And if she could make her comments, please, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. My name is Elizabeth Biscay. I'm the special advisor to the minister responsible for status of women with the government of the Northwest Territories. I work with the Women's Advisory Office, and the Women's Advisory Office deals with gender equality and any matters related to women. So there's a number of projects we work on, including missing murdered Indigenous women, family violence. We also deal with gender-based analysis plus implementation of, development of, and generally just working with community groups like the Native Women's Association, Status of Women Council, so forth, to advance equality for women. How much time do I have? 10 minutes?
More like 5.
5 minutes? Okay, I'll try to make this really quick. One of the projects that our office worked on is the Women in Leadership Initiative. This was an initiative that started a few years ago, and it focused on trying to get more women in leadership roles. We have had worked within the Status of Women Council, Native Women's Association to do campaign school for women. And last year, we got funding from the federal government to do the Women Leadership Initiative, and that included developing training material and holding a number of campaign schools for women across the territories. We also worked on developing a curriculum that's a Made in the North curriculum, which was finalized, and we're currently piloting it now. The funding also allowed us to develop a campaign, a marketing campaign called She Can. And that's the purpose of that campaign, is to increase awareness of women in leadership roles. We have a large Indigenous population in the territories, and sometimes there's reluctance to vote in women because of, I would say, some people say it's, that's not our custom, but it's, if you really look back at the history, that isn't. The first speaker talked about colonialism, impact of colonialism. A lot of that was born from that. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to deal with when we do the She Can marketing campaign, is to let voters know that women are capable leaders. And so our marketing campaign uses role models. We had 4 role models that we used, and from the communities, and the quotes and so forth. Those She Can posters have been translated into all the Indigenous languages and will be released. The translated versions will be released shortly. We've also done work with the Status of Women Council, cooperated with them to do Women in Leadership. They've done the Women in Leadership gatherings. This year, we're going to be co-hosting those gatherings with them. And that's just to give women an opportunity in the communities to get together and talk about the issues and concerns they have with women, trying to get women in leadership roles. We also have developed a website that we're hoping to finalize and launch very soon. That online portal will give access to users the training material that we develop, all the marketing campaign material that we have. Will also provide other resource and links to other sites, where it'll provide resource material for women who are interested in either running for leadership or supporting a woman to run for leadership. We've also worked with Both Native Women's Association, Status of Women Council, to do a lot of the leadership, women leadership initiatives. I think some of the results of all those initiatives is in the municipal elections in 4 of the major centers in the Northwest Territories were women. In total, we had 6 mayors that were elected in the municipal elections. In some of the First Nations elections, more and more women are running, and we have a few chiefs, but there's a lot of women who are on council. And the most telling, I think, was the territorial elections, where we had a large number of women running for the territorial elections, and 9 women were elected out of the 19 positions. And cabinet is comprised of 4 women and 2 men, plus the premier, who was first a woman, and she's Métis. We have a number of Indigenous women. Of the 9 women that are elected, I believe 5 of them are Indigenous women who were elected. So this initiative seems to be having a good positive impact, and we're more than happy to share our results and on the things that we've done. And the program is currently being evaluated now, and we're hoping that the results of the evaluation will give us feedback with recommendations on how we can further improve that initiative. So that's a very quick summary of the Women in Leadership Initiative that we're undertaking here in Northwest Territories.
No, thank you, Sabeth. Thank you very much. Like an amazing program that you are running, and the results really transforming what's going on in Northwest Territories. Our next speaker is also from Northwest Territories, Bridget Larocque, who is the co-vice chair of Sustainable Development Working Group for the Arctic Council and head of delegation for the SWG from the Arctic Athabascan Council. Bridget, please.
Thank you, Andre. So I'll just share my screen. So my presentation this morning will be on Indigenous women's responsibilities, whispered undertones. Have about 7 slides. That's just my little cloud map there. So earlier this month, David Sproul, who's a senior Arctic official for Canada, made a statement to the Northern Perspective on Arctic Security panel. He states that the Arctic is experiencing a period of profound change. Climate change is warming the Canadian North 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, affecting the land, biodiversity, and cultural and traditions of our northern peoples. Additionally, rapidly advancing technology is making the region more accessible, driving international interest in the region for its potential natural resources, shipping routes, tourism, and scientific research. While these activities represent economic opportunities for Canadians, they also bring unwelcome side effects in the form of threats to the environment and human security. So I question, how will these interests continue to impact Indigenous women's responsibilities? We come from an interconnected worldview, so what impacts our environment impacts us collectively, all living forms on this land. In Indigenous ways of knowing, every living thing has a set role, and every person has a gift, and that gift has to be nurtured throughout our lifetime. With this gift, we have responsibilities. We have to nurture the gift in a good way, as this gift is our wisdom. It is who we are. It is our story. The nurturing comes from our older relatives, our elders, and our storytellers. So once our environment is disturbed in any manner, then the nurturing of our gift is also disturbed. We've had many disturbances in our lifetime: colonization, Indian Act, 60 Scoop, pandemics, settlement, and residential school. Every disturbance has and continues to have huge impacts on our mental health, physical health, economic health, social position, and teachings. The nurturing development of our gifts are not only from oral teachings, it is also land-based, from what we see and observe from our environment. The teachings are from both parents and from male and female relatives, from our animals and the weather. Everything is connected and important to our teachings and our resilience and our ultimate responsibility to protect our land and water. So where are the women's voices, the grassroots voices, and on all of these issues? In June 2019, a report of the Special Senate Committee on the Arctic titled Northern Lights, a wake-up call for the future of Canada, states government policies must align with various priorities of Northerners, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, empowering Northerners to create their own programs and initiatives. The ultimate goal in our committee's view should be the eventual devolution of decision-making powers about Northern issues to Northern institutions. Decisions about the North must be made in the North, for the North, and by the North. So my thinking is we need consultation with women here, lengthy dialogue, and specific doable actions. In a recent news article, what could implementing UNDRIP look like in the NWT? Published November 16th and written by Megan Brackenberry. There were 5 male voices expressing their opinions. The only female voice came from the Nuvik Twin Lakes riding, our MLA, Lisa Semler, a member of the special committee put together by the Legislative Assembly to deal with UNDRIP. Semler stated, she and her colleagues are there to listen and to try and move the process forward. If it means we're listening to the Indigenous leaders from that group, or we need to reach out to the community, and that's what the Indigenous groups say we need to do, that's what we'll be doing. It all depends on the community, the Indigenous groups, and what they want. In the same article, Gary Bailey, president of the NWT Métis Nation, stated that the federal government has an obligation to Aboriginal people, and if it means us having a direct relationship and excluding the GNWT, I'm sure all the Aboriginal groups will be prepared to do so. On the GNWT Executive Indigenous Affairs webpage, it states, work with Indigenous governments to create and implement an action plan that identifies changes required in GNWT legislation and policies to best reflect the principles set out in UNDRIP. Special note, Indigenous governments are the land claim and self-government organizations, predominantly men holding titles of president and grand chief. How will work with women and consultation with women work in developing the UNDRIP action plan? In closing, in Indigenous worldview and governance, Indigenous women have responsibilities equal to men, and everything that impacts men impacts women. But in the patriarchal system, the woman's voice and place is ignored and silenced. Although reports and news articles, language looks and sounds inclusive, that is not the reality for women here in the NWT. Merci, Cho, and thanks for inviting me to the panel.
Thank you, Bridget, very much. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and placing the gender discussion we're having today within the context of broader human and Indigenous people's rights. I think it's very important that we connect those, because otherwise, if they remain disconnected, we would not be able to address them comprehensively. I think that's really an important point. Thank you. So our next speaker is Søren Stach Nielsen from Greenland. He had a wonderful career in Greenlandic government, but his main or very important contribution has been also in some other things that he will share with us right now.
Thank you. First of all, well, thank you for the invitation to join you and to talk about this, what I'm going to talk about. It's about men's group. Years ago, in 2001, there were 3 psychologists who would like to start a men's group with different approaches. And we were a number of men who joined it. And as I recall it, I think we were 10 at the beginning, with all the things of what we are dealing with. It was supposed to be running just for 3 months, then it was supposed to stop. But after 3 months, there was a couple of us who were thinking, no, this is too good for us. We can't just stop now while we start to talk about what is it that make us mad, which will make us having anxiety, what makes us jealous, etc. Because that was the 3 recurring words we could hear during these 3 months. There was anger, anxiety, and jealousy. So we decided, no, let's continue or build up a new group run by ourselves, maybe in cooperation with one of these psychologists. There's a very important aspect to understand that these 3 psychologists, whom started this group, had a Greenlandic, South African, and Kurdish background. The reason why I'm saying it is that at least for the 2 of them, or all 3 of them, they know what it means to be suppressed. And later we discovered that the anger some of us had and the anxiety, they were very familiar of it, so we could use a lot of their experiences as human beings in our group. I've been wondering throughout the years, why did we have such a great success? We had approximately 100 men through our groups, a Greenlandic speaking, a Danish speaking. I had the Greenlandic speaking. And when I'm thinking about it, I still come to the same answer. That is, first of all, we built up a framework, which was that if you know about anger, anxiety, jealousy, then you are more than welcome to join the group, because that's what it is about. And the framework was also that you just can't come in the group and start talking. No, you have to speak. At that time when we began, with 1 psychologist and a group leader, because 2 of them was going to say, talk with the new guy to see whether there's anything else besides the 3 words? Does he have any abuse of frog, etc.? That is not something the group could handle, because it's just not that kind of group. So we had a frame, we knew how to start. So we just started. And the way we did it was very similar to what I know is called the talking circles in Alaska. So I took a little bit of that and took what we usually did with the 3 psychologists. We just began slowly, once a week, talking about, okay, how do you feel today? If there was somebody in the group who would like to say, I got something I would like to say today. So we let them just begin, and the rest of the group could make remarks if it is something he could understand what the other guys were saying. And one other very important aspect is that we could all look at each other. We could all see the sorrow, the anger, whatever it was. We couldn't no longer hide our feelings. That was very, very important to respect that each of us have different approaches to why we joined the group. So the framework was very important. And I mentioned how to join the group, so that is what we did. But it took us quite a long time to build up confidence. So after 2 or 3 years, we discovered that to build up a kind of confidence within the group and with newcomers is that you have to join the group for 6 months. And that's usually after 6, 7 months, the individual or the one guy starts talking about that he has been abused, or that he has been beating wife, a girlfriend, etc. And that was of course a turning point for the other guy, because then he joined the group for many more months, and that's how we continued. So approximately 100 men went through the groups, and still today, many years after, when we meet, we can still remember how it was to be able to join a group where you have a sacred time. It's your time. Nobody's going to make remarks of what they're doing unless the other guy knows what it is. It became a safe haven. Well, that's about it. I hope that some of you can use our experiences. So anyway, thank you.
No, Soren, thank you very much for sharing this wonderful story, kind of illustrating how civic groups could really step in and help and bring in very important elements to the society that may be missing otherwise, and also highlighting that, you know, man is also, discussion about man and within the gender conversation is also very important, and should not be, of course, forgotten, and has to be going hand in hand with other genders that we're talking about. So our last speaker for today is Hartla Grund-Logadattir from Harvard University, director of the Arctic Initiative, and she's going to tell us another interesting story about their project. Please.
Thank you so much, Andre. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's been a real pleasure in general to co-organize and host the Resilience Forum this year. I'm going to talk today about a project that stands very close to my heart. It's called Project Girls for Girls, and is operating in different corners of the world. As you may know, at the Arctic Initiative, I focus on social innovation, ocean pollution, and energy. So it's a bit far from those topic areas, but this is a project that we've been developing now since 2016. So if I start, we've been talking about the situation in different communities and so forth across the Arctic. But if I start by zooming out and sharing a bit some key facts and figures of women's equality in the world, you know, the world as it looks now, we have less than 25% of all women, of all parliamentarians being women. We have 11 women currently serving as a head of state, 12 are serving as head of government. And in general, if you look at leadership in companies. If you look at board members, the figures are still very low in most cases, in most communities. If you then look at different indexes, you can see that the Nordic countries actually often score very high there. My home country, Iceland, is scored here #1 on this gender gap index ranking from the World Economic Forum this year. Still then, when you start to take a closer look, when you dig deeper, you see that even though the highest scorer, there are issues that need to be addressed. In Iceland, we're facing this particularly in the private sector. Only 26% of women in the executive roles are women. 10% of CEOs are women, and 90% of board members are women. And these figures are from 2018, and they haven't changed that much. So this was the dimensions that we started talking about when it came to developing Girls for Girls. We saw that even in the countries scoring highest on the list, we still were facing these gaps. So we came together, women from India, Mexico, the US, China, Middle East, Uganda, and Malaysia, and we started comparing notes. We started discussing the reality in different countries, and we found out that, as I said again, even in the country scoring at the highest, the problems are still there. And of course, they're much more serious in other parts of the world when it comes to women being represented in different parts of society. So, as has been mentioned here, we figured out that the challenge is not necessarily the legal frameworks. Often the case is that the legal frameworks are allowing for women to run for office. There's nothing hindering women for being CEOs and so forth. But still the progress is slow. So what is holding women back? That was our main question. And as in many cases, those are often other factors than the law. It's a question of culture. It's a question of role models and other items. And that led to the foundation of Girls for Girls, where we are creating a program that nurtures, supports, and empowers women to take lead in different corners of society. And I think that has been highlighted so much here during the different presentations, especially in Maria's presentation, that equality, gender equality, is of course something that we need to address across the board. So how does all of this work? How does Girls for Girls operate? It operates through 3 different things. We have mentorship, we focus on learning, skill-based learning, and then it's the network element. And here you can see the first component. We simply engage women from politics, from the business sector, and from the NGOs and every corner of society to work with us. And we ask for their time to mentor young women. And you can see here some pictures from Iceland. You can see here some pictures from Uganda. This is actually Uganda's Minister for Trade that are serving as an advisors and mentors in Girls for Girls. All of these women volunteer to meet with a group of young women in their respective community. And the way this works is that usually the mentor meets with a group of young women 5 or 6 times. And you can see here again some photos from different meetings in Uganda, in Uzbekistan, in the US, and so forth. And of course, what happens is that the women that participate, the young women that participate, they form a network amongst themselves, a supportive network that then lasts after the program. And then they also become a part of Girls for Girls alumni network, and then they can rely on each other when they're doing global projects and need support on different matters related to their leadership journey. We then, each and every session of Girls for Girls, we're focusing on a different theme. One of the sessions is, for instance, on negotiation. And we've been lucky enough to be able to engage different Harvard faculty that focuses on those subjects to provide content here that can be used as a background material. So in the case of negotiation, we're lucky to have one of our advisors, Kesley Hong, who teaches negotiation at Harvard, provide the fundamental material that is then used in the session. And it's incredible by just practicing, doing sample exercises. You know, you see how the participating women manage to do simple things as negotiating for higher salary or entering a new venture. So it's been extremely inspiring to see the result from just these simple, just from this simple structure. Another example of a skill-based training is on arts of communication. You can actually train how you deliver a message in a board meeting or how you give a speech. These are simple skills that is easy to go through and can again accelerate that we're empowering girls to take action, to have the courage to take action. So far, again, we started in 2016. We're now operating in over 20 countries, big operations in Africa, Asia, and across the world, really. 250 mentors that are participating. All of them are doing this as volunteer. These are women that want to see progress happening faster, and they're happy to share their wisdom, to share their expertise and help guide younger women and empower them. And so far we have mentored more than 2,000 girls in these 21 countries. And they are in the age between 16 and 25. And of course, you know, we're either partnering directly with universities or local organizations or simply advertising for participants. But the program is tailored based on the needs of each community. You know, the challenges, as has been discussed here today, are very different depending on the context, and it's important for these projects to be tailored to the needs of each community. So 2 ideas that I wanted to throw out here. The first one is that, you know, we have been operating in Iceland. We've just mentored about 100 girls here in Iceland, but we haven't been operating in other places in the Arctic region. So if someone is interested in setting up Girls for Girls in their community, getting access to the network and working with us, please reach out, and hopefully we can do some good work together. The second thing is, and this is something that Maria has already touched upon, is about data collection. I was very impressed by some of the information that she presented, but I was wondering whether it might be an idea to think about some sort of an index that provides visual information about how different communities are doing on the gender scale. And I'm thinking about this, maybe it would be useful to do it even on a city level or a town level. You could kind of create a competitive element here, having towns even in different parts of the Arctic compete, if you will, in this space to be the most gender equal. So this is the end of my comments here. Wonderful again to be with you, and looking forward to working with you all.
Thank you, Hartla. You know, interesting, of course, project, but also suggestions that we could, I guess, entertain and think in respect, maybe even next gender equality report in the Arctic. So thank you. So that's wraps up the list of the speakers. So what we're gonna do now is to have maybe opportunity for 2 questions, and then we'll go to our rest of the speakers who will reflect and provide some reflections on what we have heard, and also our discussants in a few minutes as well. So the question, I guess, just address it to anyone, but I mean, it's actually kind of Canada geared, so maybe our Canadian participants could provide some insight. So it's really talking about gender-based analysis, and government entities and the scientists very often do some kind of analysis of impacts or socioeconomic conditions for that involve gender-based analysis, but it's very rare that they actually include some sort of indigenous perspective. So Trevor Donald is asking, how could we do better about including indigenous perspective on gender in those kinds of assessments? So if anyone would like to take that from the panelists, and you can all turn on your cameras, I guess.
It's Carla here. Thank you very much for really intriguing and interesting input from all over the place. And I'm very happy to hear the great diversity of the presenters and really different perspectives. That's just really nice. The frustration that I had doing this on my own work and subsequently what I hear, namely that of having to kind of finger point at the existing governing structures in the within the Arctic nations. And when we are talking about gender in that regard, it becomes more or less like a warfare between men and women. And that I'm sure will not settle that well, because as you heard from my presentation and that of the NWT representatives, both Bridget and her colleague, and that of Sue Cern, we are all in this mess, whether we are men or women, doesn't really matter. So as far as the indigenous experiences are concerned, and the very fact that prior to the colonization, that our own ancestors have really dealt with gender equality in a meaningful, grounded ways, where each one of us, whether we're male or female, have a say in how we run our lives to find good ways of dealing with anything. So here we are, lacking terms and terminology in many ways to finger point at patriarchy, the way in which that the political structures have adopted the patriarchy, that I am sure is not something that the existing nation states really are proud of. So I think we have to find really diverse ways and take a leadership in finding new terminology that speaks to that, so that our own Arctic nation states are not going to be sensing that there's a warfare between male and female, indigenous, non-indigenous, but actually finger pointing at the political organizations systemically prefer the patriarchy, and maybe find another word for patriarchy than that we know, because immediately heads are up like against that word too, So Arctic Council being one of those leading ones in the world in global setting, we can actually do that, of taking some kind of leadership and finding some new terminology that denotes that whole thing of having to do something about situation from which we are all in that game, really. That's all I have.
I think it's some corporate use, I guess, terminologies, right? That would be maybe very, very interesting. Anyone else on the panel would like to chime in on that? Bridget?
Sure, Andre. Yeah, Carla, like you put more deeper thought into this, and thank you for that. But just to add that, when we talk about terminology too, that it has to come from our respective worldviews, and it has to be appreciated by the partners and the individuals and the organizations we work within. because we too often come up with terms or definitions, then those definitions are challenged. Right now, when we talk about, gender, the concern being male, female, when we talk about systemic racism, now they're questioning, well, what does that really mean? So, when we're working within this system, and I'll allude to what Carla said too, then we really have to be welcoming it and I don't know, championing it, because our words do matter and it impacts our lives. So, but whatever we can do to move terminology to benefit the cause, I think would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we have to move on quickly to the reflections, but I also encourage all panelists. I mean, in the Q&A, there are some questions that could be answered through that medium. So, and if you have an opportunity, just look there. But we're moving on to reflections, and they were provided by Juna Bethelson, who is, of course, on the Youth Advisory Board for our gender equality in the Arctic report, as well as Farouz Gaini, who is a professor at the University of Faroe Islands, and Embla Erodeter, who is the director of the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network and lead of the Arctic Equality in the Arctic Project. So please, Juno, just a couple of minutes, reflections. I don't know if we can see you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but not see you, yes.
I'll try again.
I mean, we can hear you, so that's good already.
Okay, I'll just start. So first of all, I want to thank you, all of you, thank all the organizers for this invitation. It's been really, really inspiring and very rewarding to hear all of these presentations. And I think one of the most important things I do think needs to be said, and several of the presentations have hinted towards it, is the level of colonization that's been happening, not just in the Arctic, but all over the world, and how colonization has affected indigenous people's lives, and how our culture continuously is being eroded and kind of marginalized when we set up these structures in terms of governance and what we call development. So one very important thing for me to emphasize is that in this work going forward, we need to focus a lot on decolonization with everything that that term implies. We need to, whether we're talking about politics or we're talking about equality between different categories or groups of people, different racialized groups, or we're talking about gender roles and ideas about gender, we need to focus a lot more on decolonization in that work going forward, and that's especially important in an Arctic perspective. I really enjoyed the presentations from the Northwestern Territories and the input that Carla had in her opening statement, and Søren Nielsen, and hearing about these talking circles or the talking groups that have, I'm pretty sure, have a huge impact on those people's lives who are actually participating in that kind of in those kinds of initiatives. I experienced when I was in Canada, I was on exchange in Canada, and I took a course at the University of Victoria, a course titled Indigenous Approaches to Helping and Healing. And I do think that both in Greenland, where I'm from, and in the rest of the Arctic, we need to be talking a lot more about how toxic masculinity and how Western ideas about gender are really destructive, and how we can dismantle those ideas and work towards a future where we look at each other as human beings and not certain categories that are in a hierarchy relative to each other. I think those would be my main points in my reflections.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very insightful. So our next person with reflections, Firuz Gaini, please.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting to listen to all the presentations today. And here in the what you could call the southern periphery of the Arctic, here in the Faroe Islands, we can recognize and resonate a lot of the discussions that are raised in the presentations, at the same time as maybe we have some other challenges. I really enjoyed all the presentations, and maybe especially Carla Williamson's contribution was very important, I think, because I think from a Faroese perspective also that it's very important to avoid just reproducing and recreating very kind of stereotyped binary gender oppositions, which often are very far from the realities of the population. And so I think we have to look at gender in a larger perspective, in a larger context, maybe in a kind of intersectional approach. And where the colonial history is, of course, very important for many of the societies, but also other changes in society. For instance, in the Faroe Islands, we have also new groups, we have new minorities, we have new immigrant groups, and the whole question about the gender and identity and belonging is all the time negotiated. And there are a lot of people who feel that they are in between or in kind of mixed groupings. So that's one thing I think is important to reflect on in the discussion about gender equality in the Arctic. Another issue which is, I think, implicit in many of the discussions, but which could be emphasized more, is the relation between generations, the intergenerational relations. The young people, the young adults, and the relation to the older generations regarding their gender identities and their values about gender and society and identity, which might also be connected to rural, urban, or other socioeconomic divisions. So I think it's important to at the same time as we try to define and discuss the common challenges, also to go more deeply into the context and look at what kind of divisions or fractions and tensions are within the societies. So that's my comments for now.
Oh, thank you. It's very, very helpful to think of those things that way. So our last speaker on reflections panel is Embla Roddetir from the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network and GIA report. Embla.
Thank you, Andre. I will try to be brief. I have enjoyed enormously the presentations today and the discussion today. And I just want to share with you how we at in the project Gender Equality in the Arctic, we have, through our work, realized to a greater degree the importance of equality, diversity, and justice by both in the legal and non-legal understanding of that term, and whether it be gendered or otherwise, when it comes to community viability, well-being, and resilience, especially in a time of astounding environmental change, which is coupled with social and economic change, and of course, our latest addition, our beloved coronavirus. We also fully understand the significance of empowerment of women, men, youth, indigenous populations, and communities in general to adaptive capacity in the face of change. And as we know, adaptive capacity is the very core of sustainable development and resilience. Of course, what we still don't understand is why this is not self-evident to absolutely everyone, which is why we need to continue to try to raise the visibility of both gender, the significance of empowerment for resilience. As we've heard today, empowerment can take many faces and forms. It has multifaceted implications at national, institutional, community, or even individual level. Gaining better understanding of the relationship between empowerment and resilience becomes ever more important through these transitional times. That is, if we hope to move forward to greater clarity and understanding of these complex dynamics, leading hopefully, or ideally, to better policymaking in the region. We've also heard today the modes of empowerment can be drawn from different sources, whether it be through infrastructural robustness, political, economic, or civil empowerment, youth engagement, knowledge sharing, leadership programs, entrepreneurship, men's groups, She Can, Girls for Girls, and so on. This type of sharing of information and learning about successful avenues that have been pursued in the different contexts, so we may learn from each other, is of enormous importance. This is why I'm so grateful for the dialogue we have participated in here today. Finally, and I'm sure, yes, I can see Andre's face. I'm very thankful for being a part of this session. It's been both powerful and educational, and it reminds us of the need to think inclusively. Two more words. And it also reminds us why we must continue to raise visibility of the importance of gender in all aspects of life. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. It's very important to hear this thoughts coming from someone who spent so much effort on our GEA reports throughout the years, and it's really a process that in itself kind of supporting those ideas that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Just a quick remark is that there are some questions on the Q&A, and Hartley, if she could look, I mean, she could probably answer one of them. But our very important person for this panel is our discussant. Tonya Johansson from Sami Council's Arctic and Environmental Unit. If she could provide some closing thoughts, some kind of highlights that she feels this session delivered, and that would be very, very important, very interesting for us. Tonya, please.
Thank you so much, Andre, for that introduction. I would like to give thanks to all of the participants of this Arctic Resilience Forum session. We have heard very different presentations and perspectives, but I feel that they are all connected to each other. And this shows how complex the topic of gender and resilience is, and how important it is to shed light on this in the Arctic. And I would like to highlight the words from our lead speaker today, Carla Jessen Williamson, related to an empowerment for indigenous peoples, and how she talked about that this happens when we take back our history, and that indigenous empowerment is met through regaining back land, resources, taking back our languages, our ways of knowledge, and perhaps mostly important in my eyes is taking back the authority to educate our children. And she also talked about holistic ways of knowing and holistic ways of being, and that in an indigenous connection to the land, we are not gendered. and that our intellect is not gender. And I think this is a very good reflection on the indigenous communities' views upon this. And then we heard from Maria Rosanova-Smith, and she talked about the difference in gender participation in politics and workspace in the Arctic, and that the lack of female representation in various domains of power is actually quite a problem in the Arctic. And that we have a wage gap and a gap in leader positions, and that and as Maria said, that without mining these gaps, we cannot have sustainable development in the Arctic. And one thing I think was really good that Maria said was that male empowerment is also important, because gender does not equal just female, and that thriving genders contribute and depend on thriving communities. And I think these are very important words. And then we had Varvara Korkina, who also brought up the topic of female entrepreneurship in the Arctic and the importance of this for developing the economy and the communities, perhaps particularly the indigenous communities, and how this plays a role in preserving local culture and traditional livelihoods. And we also heard from Elizabeth Biscay, and she talked about female leadership and how in her community they are challenging colonialism through empowering women and lifting them up as leaders. And my indigenous heart especially got warm when she mentioned that all of the campaign material from the She Can project was translated to all of the indigenous languages in the area. I think that empowering indigenous women through our languages are very important. And she also shared to us the success of their project and the success they had in the political sphere. And this program sounds to me like a great example of best practices that more indigenous peoples and communities can learn from. And so we had Bridget Larocque, and she talked about indigenous women's responsibilities, and she highlighted how when the Canadian government has voiced that there is an increased interest in the Arctic area, and she wondered how this affects indigenous women's security and the security of the land and the environment. She also talked about how nature and environment and people are all connected, and she highlighted that the increased interests in the north has to happen with consultation with women, indigenous women, and that indigenous voices needs to be heard. And I think this is a message that all indigenous people can support, and that we all recognize the difficulties we have in being heard when other have interests in our land areas. And then we had a very interesting sharing from Søren Stak-Nielsen about how they have approached men and male anger and male anxiety and jealousy, where they have created this group for men run by men and by the help of free psychologists, and how important it was to have psychologists that knew what it means to be oppressed. I think this is very important when we are dealing with indigenous mental health. And he showed us how when you give men charge, they also continued the work after the 3 months, and they themselves carried on to have these conversations. And I think this is a very good example of best practices that we can all learn from, and that the violence against women are not solved without including men, and the violence against men are also not solved without men. In my opinion, indigenous men holds an important key to solve the issues in many indigenous communities related to violence because these issues are not just female issues. And then we had the last speaker, Halla Hurund Logadottir. She talked about this project Girls for Girls and how they empower girls all over the world, and that the project shared experiences across the world, and that they saw that the challenges in the gender gaps are often the same, even in countries with different policies. And this is a great, I hope that other women in the Arctic take opportunity of this great network. And then on the reflections, we heard from three people, Una Bertelsen, Firuz Gaini, and Embla Oddsdottir, and they all raised very important topics such as colonialism and how this affects indigenous lives, and that we need to talk about decolonization when we work on gender and equality, and also how gender needs to be a focus in all of our society's work and in intersectional ways. And also thank you to Embla Oddsdottir for a great sum up of the gender project. And with this, I would like to pass the word back to Joel Clement from the Belfair Center's Arctic Initiative at Howard Kennedy School. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tanya. That was a fantastic summary of a fantastic session. So thanks for your remarks, and thanks to all of the speakers for your insight. As we've learned, we have a long way to go to ensure gender equity, particularly for Indigenous women in the Arctic today. But we must, and the session pointed to some excellent ongoing work, as well as indicators for where we need to do better, particularly regarding decolonization. As Maria said, empowerment of all genders in all spheres at all levels is crucial to thriving and resilient communities in the Arctic. So huge thanks to the speakers and the panelists, the organizing committee for this session, and all of you for joining and asking some fantastic questions. Remember the Slack channel if you want to keep the conversation going. And please tune in for next week's session on the role of ecosystems in supporting Arctic resilience. Following that, we'll have sessions on financing resilience, infrastructure, and Indigenous knowledge. So there's still a lot in store. Thanks again for joining. We'll see you next Wednesday. And in the meantime, stay healthy and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.